My name is Paul Hawkins. I'm the Chief Combobulator at Crazy Might Work, as Idea has pointed out. And the colleague on my left-hand side, your right, is Melanie Farmer. Melanie is our concierge of co-creation. So it's very relevant to the discussion that we're having tonight about how you actually create and leverage an ecosystem for the purpose of innovation. So I might hand over to Melanie, because tonight is going to be all about participation and interacting with you and hearing some of your thoughts as we explore this very big topic. So Melanie, what is the modus operandi for tonight?
Okay, so really great to see you all here, and good to see people starting to interact on the chat. So we want you to get the most out of this, and so it's good for us to give you positive feedback. And I would say that in Crazy Might Work, we have a bell in the office. So whenever we have a big win or something like that, we ring a bell. It sounds a little bit like this. So like, we're going to give you some positive reinforcement for those times when we come to questions, and we'll invite your comments in the chat to respond to that. And when we see something that we think, you should leave your day job and go and do that, we'll be ringing the bell. So, and probably we're going to steal your ideas. That's for sure what we want to be doing here. But I would say, so it's just to give you some feedback and some competition, because what your goal will be is to get us to ring that bell.
Thanks, Melanie. As Adi mentioned, we're Melanie and I from an organization called Crazy Might Work, which, as you'd expect from any kind of innovation business, was launched on a Russian icebreaker in Antarctica in 2015. And the focus is really to work with leaders to ensure that the innovation that you do has impact. And of course, this is where ecosystems really come into play. That they're so in many ways superior to supply chains and value chains in terms of just delivering value, because they do that in such unexpected configurations. And so we'll be exploring a little bit of that tonight. We have had the joy and the privilege of working to set up at least a dozen different kinds of ecosystems in the last couple of years, from looking at Australia's national innovation ecosystems through to space biology and other areas in health and elsewhere in justice. So we've made a lot of mistakes in that time, and so what we're hoping to share with you tonight is just some of the learnings that we've had out of those experiences, good and bad, and we've categorized those into two very typical consulting categories, I have to say. So I'm not proud of this, but we've categorized them into systems, processes and platforms, and people. But I'm hoping that notwithstanding the categories, the content will be very interesting and challenging for you. So let's get right into it. We're going to start off just talking a little bit about ecosystems as systems and how we think about that and what we've learned through our own experience. The gentleman and dear friend that we've got on screen for you now is Dr. Joshua Chow. So Josh Chow is a university in Sydney, professor at a university in Sydney called University of Technology in Sydney. And Josh's distinction, amongst many others, is that he was part of a team that have developed a very unique approach to cancers, and some of the most virulent cancers that we have. He and his team have realized that they don't respond very well to microgravity. And so this brings us back to the topic of our course tonight, which is really around building a zero gravity ecosystem. If you know anything about physics, you'll know that zero gravity doesn't actually exist. So I have to apologize for the deception in the title of our presentation tonight. But we're really talking about microgravity and taking some of that friction, providing some weightlessness in your ecosystem, but also understanding how to actually reach that objective. So Josh has a wonderful story about when before he made Australia his base, he was actually studying at Harvard University, and there was a day when he was in the laboratory. He was working a problem on the chalkboard in those days with a couple of colleagues, and they had a lot of formulae and and equations and things up on the board. And they failed to notice that a very distinguished professor walked into the room whilst they were doing this. And after a little while, they heard a clearing of the throat, and then the very distinctive voice of Stephen Hawking saying, "That will not work because nothing defies gravity." Ironically, that statement, which stopped proceedings on the day, is something that stuck with Josh for many, many years. And it was lying on a beach one day that he started to wonder if perhaps also cancer does not defy gravity. And they started to experiment with cancer in microgravity, basically free fall environments on Earth, and discovered that 4 or 5 of the most virulent cancers that they were looking at could not withstand microgravity conditions. So when they were subjected to microgravity, they weren't able to form tumors. They actually needed gravity to know how to do that. And they died within 24 hours in a microgravity environment. And so this has led to a couple of experiments now this year and last year on the International Space Station, just looking at how cancer responds to low gravity situations. But for me, this, in the context of what we're talking about ecosystems, really just underpins that idea that we're always subjected to some kind of force. We're never on the outside of an ecosystem looking in as casual observers. That's not the reality of setting up an ecosystem. You're in it, and you're a player in it. And so I think it's really good to have a kind of a humble starting point when you think about ecosystems, because you're never going to be the puppeteer sitting on the outside controlling it. You're always going to be somehow a player and a part of it. And those forces are acting on you. They influence your behaviors. They influence your beliefs, your paradigms, everything that you think about where the solution might be. And so I think that's probably when we think about ecosystems, that's been probably the fundamental lesson that we've taken away, is that you're always in it, and you're always colored by your own perspectives and point of view. And so that means you need to do a number of things to create a more holistic view and hopefully enable you to latch onto the right challenges and points of leverage within a system environment. So thanks to Josh, we know there's no such thing as zero gravity. And we know that we need to take those invisible forces into account when we think about solving really complex or wicked problems. So with that as a bit of context, I really want to highlight that for us, we've realized that an ecosystem fundamentally is a system. And so when you think about what theory is most appropriate when you're thinking about an ecosystem, well, I believe that you can't go past systems thinking. This idea that we're all, part of a system, at multiple systems at different levels. I guess fundamentally, I think we're all, as human beings, part of this system, which I hope you recognize. This is our home, the solar system. And so we're all subject to, the gravitational pull of this system, but many other systems as well. And when we experience weightlessness as astronauts moving away from the Earth, it's really because we're starting to be pulled to other things, and the intensity of Earth's gravity is falling away, but we're feeling Mars, or we're feeling the sun, and so what we're being pulled by is changing, but we're never out of it. We're never out of gravity or out of the system, and I think that's a very good kind of grounding as you think about how we, as humanity and as a society or as individuals, even solve some of our more complex challenges. So for those of you that for whom this is brand new, where you haven't been exposed to this idea of systems thinking before, or perhaps you thought it was something to do with computers or applications, it's really some of the core concepts are around us being systems being dynamic, and the fact that everything is interconnected in some way. There's a albeit tenuous relationship between every player and force within that system. It's all about causality and feedback loops. So it's going away from this very linear idea of this causes that and then it ends, or then it starts. There's constant feedback happening within the environments, whether it's the organization you work in, or the industry that you work in, or the supply or value chain, or a bigger system like your society or your industry group. So we also have realized, looking at systems like health and justice, we often find that when we're collaborating with others, they come into the process going, the system's broken, it just doesn't work. But what we actually find is that systems are operating perfectly according to the way that they are configured. So not according to the intent of the system. The intent might be to serve citizens or serve patients or serve your customer, but the incentives and the feedback loops that are actually in operation determine how the system operates. So it's hardly ever broken. It's often a bit misconfigured, and there can be great opportunities in rethinking how things are incentivized and how things are funded, or policy within a system can be massive levers for change. So we spend a bit of time always when we setting up an ecosystem looking at what's the best possible problem that we could be discussing. So where are those levers within the system that can have maximum impact if we're to focus in on some of those areas. So a bit of systems thinking never hurts. We also in working within an ecosystem, we think about systems goals. So if it was nirvana and the system was operating the way it was intended to its absolute potential, sometimes those are long-term goals. If you're talking about education in your country, or you're talking about type 2 diabetes within healthcare, or you're talking about mental health in the workplace, or any of those kinds of objectives, those tend to be longer term. And so we talk about those as North Stars or guiding stars, some of those further away objectives, but we find that it's really important to talk about some near star objectives. So some of the stepping stones that will move the system in the right direction and move you closer to creating an ecosystem that's really highly functional and serves the needs of multiple stakeholders in that environment. So nice little metaphor there from astrology. This is an example of what we call a systems map. So we'll get our stakeholders together and just think collectively about everything we know about the system. Once we've agreed, reached some kind of consensus on what we think the near and the longer term goals are of a system, we then start to map out who we think all the stakeholders are. And when we reflect on the goals of our ecosystem, we look at what might be enabling or inhibiting that. So are there policies, are there logistics, access pathways that prevent us from achieving the best possible outcome from our system? And are there other things that perhaps could accelerate or are accelerating or helping us achieve that ideal end state? So it starts to, this is a massive wall in our office, but it starts to create quite a complex picture, but it also represents the richness and diversity of the participants. So sometimes, when we're looking at a system, we might have 50 or 60 organizations participating. They all come from wildly different perspectives and backgrounds and strategies and agendas and outlooks. And so you start to build this really, deeply rich kind of tapestry of your ecosystem space. And that really helps you, particularly in the next phase, identify what some of those points of leverage are. And I'm just going to pause at this point and just deflect back a little bit to Adi and to the audience, just to ask you, what system do you most closely identify with? And Melanie, I might look to you for some thought starters around.
Yeah, like if you're going to start typing in the chat, that'll be really helpful for us. And Addy's going to keep an eye on that for us and call some of these systems out that you might identify with. For me, I start thinking about, perhaps everybody here today is part of maybe an innovation ecosystem, but you might also, think about, whether you're in the EU financial system, or maybe you're thinking about a hobby or a sport that you're involved with, and maybe you're a parent. And you're part of a family system. So there's a whole sort of diverse way of actually thinking that, probably you're not just in one system. We'd be really interested to know and get a sense of who.
So we're waiting for people to answer, but I could answer for what I think. I think that the first system that comes to my mind is my country. And then like the subsystem within it is like families and organizations and maybe companies are part of that. And And what you say about the innovation ecosystem, it's very, very obvious to me because I always deal with it. So it's very flourishing here in Israel. So that's what comes to my mind. Would you like to share your thoughts, participants, or do you want us to continue?
Thanks for sharing that idea. And I think obviously, because Israel is in one of those, top performing innovation index countries, I think the innovation ecosystem is probably better defined, in your country than many others, and so it does become something that you can actually relate to, and identify in.
Yeah, we have a comment from Jorg. He says, business-wise, I would be in the family-owned medium-sized company system and also the automotive supplier system. I think that's the name is Jorg. I'm almost sure. Did I pronounce it well? I really hope. Yeah, he said right.
Nice. Thank
you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jorg.
By the way, I don't think that in Israel it's really defined. It's like it's created by things happening. It's not like somebody thought about it and said, okay, we're going to build it this way. It's very fluent and spontaneous, I would say. But many systems are not created by definition. Alex says, professionally, I think I am several ecosystems, innovation ecosystem and HR leadership ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you both to Jorg and Alex. I think most of us would identify with more than one system. We don't classify ourselves as in just one way. And I think family and work roles would be one of the most kind of obvious separations of that. But thank you for your responses, both of you. I think that deserves a ring, Melanie. So a bit of reinforcement there.
Annoy you now.
Important in systems. But yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, I think, and I guess what we find, now that we are engaging with so many ecosystems, that each time we're, defining ourselves in a slightly different way, as a meaningful participant in that group. So it's great to see that multiple different kinds of connection are possible as you
and we have one last one. Mark says that I'm working on integrating a national health ecosystem. Very important, especially these days. Thanks, Mark.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Well, you would probably have taken a bit more detail out of the previous slide we were looking at. It was actually an example of integrated healthcare, which I think is very much the mantra, at the moment that people are thinking about how do we just provide a much more connected service, for citizens and patients. So that's such a crucial system. I think it's exactly, the kinds of areas where impact needs to be made.
Can I make a comment on that? Yeah. So Mark, I wanted to say about what a big job, especially right now. In Australia, we had a real challenge about keeping our nurses and doctors in a local area rather than traveling across cities and long distances. During the pandemic, we wanted to keep them local. So there was a whole move in the first 3 months of the pandemic last year to limit the distance that nurses and doctors would go, but it required a whole system thinking kind of rework so that casual nurses and so on would not find themselves having to travel a long way. And of course, they'd be swapping hospitals, and that was madness. So everyone's happier. They're all working closer to home, and for patients and the community, it's actually safer that they're not traveling as far. But what a big job that was.
I have to say that I'm stuck in the middle of the sentence of the pandemic last year. Then it's like, then it stopped for me.
Okay. I think in Australia, obviously, we're a much smaller population, and it's much easier to control here than some other areas. We're not as connected, as you are where you are, but I certainly think, some of the systems thinking and even, combinations of that with design thinking have contributed to, very successful, contact tracing campaigns and methodologies and things like that have really employed that agile thinking, so it hasn't all been luck. I think there's been a lot of, very careful systems and design and, even appreciative inquiry has gone into those methodologies. And we've worked very closely with, intensive care and ambulance and some of those emergency response services to try and get these ways of thinking through the system. So it's great to see that it's catching on, and we're seeing some results. So guys, the second aspect, which I just skipped through, so we're moving on a little bit there to systems, really from systems to looking at processes and platforms. So I really think systems thinking holds a lot of keys for us to identify the right stakeholders and the right problems, within a systemic environment. But if we just move on to processes and platforms, one of the things that we did wrong in the early days with our ecosystems is we allowed them to turn into what we call a talk fest. So they became these kind of debates where experts would turn up and show their expertise. And the person with the loudest voice spoke for the longest, and really nothing happened between meetings. So it kind of became the stagnant, thought leadership forum, and there wasn't a lot else going on. And so what we realized through experience is that this kind of innovative collaboration actually needs a methodology. It actually needs something that keeps people moving and takes them towards a bias for action. And that often means breaking into much smaller units. We with our cross-sensory collaborations and ecosystem build, we really break into units of 4 to 6, which we think is a scientifically supported functional group of human beings. And we allow them to actually chase after whatever they think is the most impactful part of that ecosystem. So we literally unleash, these teams of 4 to 6. It's because of our origins, it's a bit of an Antarctica analogy. We think about those Zodiac craft, the inflatable that you can see pictured on screen now. But we really say, we're not going to bet the mothership on anything. That stays, kind of moored for the time being. But we want to unleash all these small teams of scientists and multidisciplinary experts to let them pursue what they think is actually going to make the difference, and see which of those ideas, really emerge as being game changers. And so, at any one time in a cross-industry collaboration or ecosystem build, we've got, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of these teams doing whatever they strongly believe in, and then reporting back into the mothership so that we can see what actually gets traction, and what actually has impact within those ecosystems, focusing on particular levers. So 2 things. One is there's a concept of autonomy here, of unleashing agile teams. There's a concept of bias to action, which is that it's not a talk fest. If you turn up, then you're here to do work. It doesn't matter what level you are in the ecosystem, and it's about giving the freedom for the teams to explore those things. We put an overarching timeline and a methodology over our ecosystem, so that there's that accountability. We know when teams are going to report back and what methods they'll be using for, say, field research or exploration of ideas. So it's probably a lot more, structure or, control than you would see in many, ecosystem builds. But we think it just allows us to maintain that energy and enthusiasm and that excitement of being part of that environment. So the second thing is that we look at gamification, and we look at the use of tools and platforms across the ecosystem. So we're always actively looking for tools that enable us to collaborate cross-organization. Those teams that I just spoke about are all cross-organizational. They're multifunctional and multidisciplinary. And so we need a way for them to interact, sometimes across geographies, across disciplines. And so this is a particular platform that we've developed for that purpose called Feisty Fish. You can see it's highly gamified. It's in about 9 countries now, depending on the ecosystems that we're developing or working with. But there are, this is not the only platform in that space. There are multiple platforms like this, but you really need tools that are cross-organizational. Most of our tools are, ERP-based and insular and inward-looking. And so, a successful ecosystem really requires a tool set that allows for, very free and agile interaction and that supports those methodologies and processes that we spoke about a moment ago. So,
what are these fish for?
Yeah, so the fish are ideas. So these are game-changing concepts that have been generated by the different teams. If we were to click on any one of those, it would open up the concept and all the interaction that's happening around that idea. So it's just a very gamified way of representing idea generation and development. And it's normally against an overarching challenge that we've identified as a leverage point within our ecosystem. So that's what that's all about. And you can see there are predators and sharks in there as well. It's the world can be a dangerous place, but it's mostly fun when it comes to feisty fish. But just moving on then, we wanted to just ask you, so that's one example of a cross-organizational process and tool or platform, but really interested in what else you might be using, so whether there's anything else out there that you've had experience with which you think really facilitates that kind of cross-organizational collaboration and working together. So please jump into the chat if you've experienced or used anything that works for you.
And of course, like while you're thinking about that and typing, it's a great opportunity for others to be just taking note of those things. And, so it's a really good sort of peer learning, I guess, opportunity to share and learn from each other about these different sorts of platforms that you might be using and tools and organizations that you might work with to, to support your journey in innovation.
Yeah, we would love to hear what you think. So I can say that I know like many software that are related to creating innovation within the organization or through the outside ecosystem. It could be an open innovation. It could be a challenge platform that you are gathering information and crowdsourcing your ideas. And this platforms allows so many more people to take part than just the leaders or the managers. So that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely, Addie. And I think that's those are the kinds of tools to be thinking about. When you're creating an ecosystem. If it's going to be aimed at a big challenge. That's cross-organizational, maybe even cross-industry. Or cross-value or supply chain, it's really important that the tool accommodates that.
Yeah, and Alex is saying we started the joint startup accelerator initiative with one of our corporate customers. So thanks, Alex. And Jorg is saying our ERP system, SAP HANA, does have a number of cross-organizational processes with customers and suppliers, but not the innovation in the innovation space, only the supply chain space.
Excellent. Oh, thanks very much for sharing. Was that Alex, Ivy?
Yeah, Alex was the first one and Jorg was the second one.
Great. Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's really important.
So just moving on to the last, probably, and in some ways the most interesting aspect of ecosystem build and experience is around people. And so I guess what you're looking at the moment is the 5th annual Solvay conference, and this is what diversity looked like back in 1912. So with some luck, you can spot the token female in this group, but this is a group of physicists that were pulled together by a Belgian industrialist called Ernest Solvay. First in 1912, and then later, this particular one was in 1927. It was the 5th get-together of a group like this. This is believed to be the most intelligent group photograph that has ever been taken, because of the 29 participants in the photo, 17 became Nobel Prize winners, and interestingly, the female in the group won 2 Nobel Prizes. So Marie Curie, who is third from the left in the front row, one away from Albert Einstein. So a very distinguished group. And sometimes when we think about biodiversity or diversity within an ecosystem, I think we recognize that it's a crucial ingredient, but we tend to be a little bit captivated by the physical characteristics of the groups. So we think about, do we have 50% male, 50% female, 50% black, 50%, other groups. Are we getting that kind of obvious kind of inherited diversity? But I guess what's interesting about this group is that although they all look the same, they're all middle-aged white male participants back in 1912, which was about as good as it could get back then. They still managed to achieve some pretty amazing innovation. And I guess what it comes down to is that some of that diversity is not obvious. It's not superficial or necessarily observable. And if you drill into the bios of each of these individuals, you'll see that their skill sets and their disciplines are remarkably diverse and different. And so whilst this doesn't represent a modern view of diversity in a group, we would expect to see much better kind of demographic spread of people. It's a good reminder that diversity is more than skin deep. And so we really want to be making sure that we're getting people in that are not ecosystem in the sense of they repeat your opinions and your voice verbatim, but they actually challenge your ideas. And one thing that this group definitely did have is a lot of controversy. So that they in 1927, when they got together, they had a big argument about a bunch of things. Einstein was just introducing this crazy theory of quantum relativity, his relativity theory, which was very hotly debated, but they were arguing about other things. And Albert was quoted as saying, God does not roll dice, to which one of the other scientists, who was Niels Bohr, responded, Einstein, stop telling God what to do. So these guys had some pretty, quotable arguments within that group over that period of time. And so what they did have was, very hot but constructive debate and to and fro of ideas with a very multidisciplinary kind of lens. So I think with the overlay that we have today, around gender diversity and demographic diversity and backgrounds, I think we can do better. So that's just something to think about, in terms of who you actually consider including in your ecosystem. But biodiversity can go too far, and this is a question for the audience, and it is this: which of these species is not native to Australia? Let's see if Alex or can get this one correct.
We'd be pretty impressed if you could name any of these species, if we're honest, because they're all pretty weird and pretty unique to our country. And there's no spiders or snakes to be pleased to see.
I would say the bunny. The bunny. The hare. York says the hare. Rabbit. Wild goose.
Actually, recognize, you can have a safe guess that's probably not one of our Australian weird animals.
Anything you've eaten is probably not on the list. So well done. You're both correct. So thanks, Melanie. So the bunny rabbit is actually representing the European rabbit, and the history of that is that back in the 1800s, a Victorian, which is one of our states, landowner decided it would be a great idea to bring some rabbits over from Europe, and so the dogs could chase and hunt them on the property. Within about 50 years, they'd invaded the whole continent because they had no natural predators in the environment. And now today, National Geographic tells us we have over 200 million rabbits in Australia. So that's roughly 10 rabbits per person. In case you're wondering why you're not seeing them jumping over Melanie and myself or in the streets when you see the news, it's because they are also able to dig warrens that are 3 meters deep and about 45 meters in length, so that they can hide away from us pretty much in perpetuity. But it's a great example of I think, bringing the wrong kind of influence into your ecosystem. And I think this is something to think about, when you are putting a group together. We find that the most successful ecosystems that we've been involved in are the ones where, there's a slightly higher purpose. People are not in it just for themselves. They actually see themselves as being part of a larger system, and they're very keen to make, a contribution, not just for themselves or even just for their company, but they're thinking about the bigger picture. And so, we highly recommend that that you think about this in terms of the diversity. Yes, we want lots of different perspectives, but we don't necessarily want agendas that are entirely commercial or selfish within an ecosystem. There needs to be some kind of give and take, and a sense to foster that sense of collaboration within the ecosystem. So we found ways over the years of ejecting members from ecosystems that are spoiling the fun for everyone else, acting in really overtly unethical or selfish ways. And I think it's important to figure out what those mechanisms are, so that if you do get a really feral species, that you've got a way of managing that, without it causing irreparable harm to the goals of the system. So obviously, in nature, the systems are often self-monitoring and managing, but not when a species that's never been there suddenly appears. So just a little bit of food for thought in terms of who you invite into your ecosystem. So we've spoken a little bit about who not to invite, but I want to just for a moment just dwell on something that I think most people don't think about when they are putting an ecosystem together. If we want to really change up aged care or healthcare or financial services or whatever it is, and move it in a positive direction, who do we need to have co-creating with us in that system? And design thinking has, I think, beaten into all of us that we need to think about extreme users, and we need to involve the customer and co-create with the customer. So normally that is not a problem. We've thought about that, and we've engaged maybe some of our strategic customers, or thought about how we get co-creation with that group. We also quite naturally go to experts. So we think about who knows a lot about, be it aged care or space or whatever it is, and we draw them into it. We invite NASA, we invite other major players into that system. But the thing that we find happens less often is this idea of thinking about exemplars that are not in our system. So who else, in some far-flung place on the planet, has had a similar kind of challenge and been very successful in that space? And so the example that I've got for you on screen is, for example, in the healthcare space, emergency departments that have been looking to innovate and reinvent how patients are processed through that, and waiting times, have learned a lot from looking at and studying Formula One pit crews. And I would say that, the step changes that they've made as a result of looking at those exemplars and other spaces have way outperformed what they've achieved through, say, benchmarking within the healthcare system. So that's kind of it's a provocative thought for you, just to, consider who are some of those exemplars perhaps that are tackling different kinds of problems, but have the similar qualities. And, what would happen if you invited them in and were able to transfer some of those learnings? So that's something that we spend a fair bit of time thinking about. And it's one of the topics that I wanted to challenge you on this evening, to get you thinking about your particular space where you operate, and who some of the exemplars out of industry might be for you. So, with that in mind, we were talking earlier about open innovation as a way of expanding the ecosystem and drawing in new ideas. I think NASA is definitely an exemplar in that space. They might not be in your industry, but they've used open innovation to run over 400 challenges. They have told us that that's reduced their R&D cost by 80%. It also has dramatically, I don't have the stats on the slide, but it's dramatically improved their speed to solution through that challenge process. And we're talking about, everything from how do we improve our algorithms for predicting solar flares and improving our reaction time to those, which is important if you're on the space station or on Mars or the moon. But right through to things like, what do we do with space poop when astronauts are a long way from sewage systems, and so that, some really interesting challenges that constitute that 400. They've had over 100 million participants. They've used multiple platforms. So I think it's really interesting, way of just thinking about expanding that ecosystem and drawing in a much wider audience. So with that, we're moving on to a bit of a reflective piece now. We wanted to just get you thinking about if you were to build an ecosystem that would be relevant for you or for your company or your industry, who would you invite to the party? And we're thinking specifically about any exemplars. So who out of industry do you think would be interesting to have there that might be able to contribute some, spark some ideas and get some imagination and some innovation happening? I've got a quick example here for you of cross-agency and cross-sector collaboration. We were approached by this logo here in the top left-hand corner, which is New South Wales Health. That's the state in which our head office is. And they said to us, one of the most persistent and pervasive challenges that we've had in our health strategy has been recruitment and retention of clinicians in rural and remote locations. And it's something that we've never been able to solve. It riles us, it aggravates us, but we don't seem to be going forward. We have the same turnover rates, we have the same retention rates, and it doesn't feel like we're making progress. And so we said to them, possibly there might be many other agencies that are faced with the same thing. So why don't we go and speak to the Premier and Cabinet and Education and Training and the Department of Primary Industries and some of the different health systems, maybe justice, ambulance, and these different locations. And why don't we also go outside of government and go and speak to an organization like Seek? So Seek, for those of you that are not familiar with the brand, is our biggest recruitment platform and job board in Australia. And it turned out they had within health and which ones were being filled and which weren't, and even what the migration rates were between states. So which states were being able to fill some of the harder, trickier roles and which weren't. And so we ended up with this kind of 14 government agency and some private sector engagement. And they were actually able to collectively produce solutions that they would never have otherwise even imagined. So what they realized very quickly through this process was that it was never ever about recruiting clinicians. So it wasn't about better advertisements or more attractive roles or better benefits. It was actually that you were never hiring one person. You were hiring their family. You were hiring their, you were asking their spouse to move out to a remote location, or their partner, the dog, the kids. So there was schooling. There was concerns around losing skills and not being as relevant or as skilled in those environments. All kinds of fears and concerns and anxieties that needed to be addressed for this to work. But when all of the agencies worked together, they were actually able to produce something working with the local government that created more of a kind of a concierge style relocation that looked at all of those elements. And so, that problem would never have been solved by New South Wales Health on their own. It was actually a systemic problem that needed very wide engagement. And so I just offer that as a quick example as we head into our first scenario. And this is a question for you. So what would you do if you were presented with this particular challenge? So this is our first scenario for you, and it's about rural and remote education. The client in this case is an organization called HETI, so the Health and Education Training Institute. They provide education and training for health professionals, clinicians and health professionals right across the whole spectrum. And their challenge is rural and remote education. So this is a problem for them. They're thinking about, how do we get a very high level of clinical, but other education and training to people that are in very remote or far-flung locations where it's very hard for us to physically get someone there. They may not have the technology all of the time that we need to provide high bandwidth services or face-to-face virtual offerings. So I'd be interested in your thoughts if you were to think about who are some of the outliers, some of those exemplars from other industries or other spaces. Who would you be recommending to them needs to be part of their ecosystem to offer fresh ideas?
And so, Paul, if you were giving me this job and we're inviting you to engage in the chat here now, I look at a problem and I search for the keywords. So here I'm looking at remote, and I think, well, where's the most remote place you could have to possibly educate somebody? And it's because someone is in that category, and I'd be thinking, well, whoever that is, that's who I want to come along, because they'll be like, this is nothing. This is like exactly what we have to do all the time. So I look at that keyword remote, and then I think about, okay, education is another keyword. So, who might need to acquire skills while they're in a really remote location that they don't already have, and something happens unexpected or whatever. So who is it that might have skills and experience? Because we're just talking about, the countryside, but let's go extreme. Who's like really the expert at, going very far remote and having to learn skills when unexpected things happen. Who might that be? And we're throwing down the challenge. Addie, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. First, my question would be, what do you mean by education? That's the first thing that would come to my mind. Like, what these people who are remote and rural, what is education for them and what they need?
It's very diverse. It's everything from clinical, like, how do you perform an appendicitis appendectomy if you've never done that before, through to, basic training on, hand sanitization and epidemic control. So all, the whole spectrum of what you'd expect to see in health.
I see. So I would think about, like, what is the current situation. I would go from there, and I would try to understand what are we trying to solve first, and then I would try to understand who confronted similar experiences. Like, is it like the fact that they're online, the fact that they don't have the devices, the fact that they cannot do it virtually, they like, what exactly is happening? They cannot bring people because it's so far away. Like, what exactly is preventing them from getting what they want?
That would be the last one. Far away, and they can't bring the coach or trainer to the person.
Yeah.
But they do have online.
Yeah.
Well, guys, there's no right or wrong here, but do you have any thoughts on who you think might bring an interesting perspective? Who would you invite?
To solve this, like, in addition to the general experts. Lynette says probably NGOs that offer financial education in rural Africa. That's what she says. Or yeah, and Alex says, well, you have sorts of online educator, Udacity, and so forth. And that's Alex.
Why I like that idea? Oh yeah, yeah. So I guess I love that NGO idea, because also they're really tight on budget. So they're going to be pretty, I think in my experience, quite creative about, how they manage to do that in a pretty economic way.
Yeah, and obviously, there'd be many places where they don't have access to robust technology, and they kind of, figuring out other ways to land that. I like Alex's suggestion around Udacity as well. I suppose, fine-tuning of the online delivery when you know that face-to-face is not an option, you really become good at that. Mm-hmm. So I think those are both excellent lines of thought. Really, really like that. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or suggestions before we give you a next complex problem?
I think you gave one example.
I didn't get another answer. Yeah.
All right.
Like, as the facilitator, I could say that we have like only a few minutes before we finalize the discussion. So I'm just helping you to maintain the time.
No, great. Thanks, Eddie. So the organization that we invited was NASA. So we got the head of training and learning and development from the International Space Station, the woman that trains all the astronauts and is responsible for their training and preparation, not only on the International Space Station, but also when they might be on the moon in coming years, or even on Mars, where there's no, only asynchronous communication is possible. So there's no live transmission of communication, and potentially dealing with emergency situations as well. And so that was amazingly rich. It doesn't get much more rural or remote than Mars. So if you've started to think through that problem, in some detail, some of the other challenges become very accessible as a result. One more, okay. So our second scenario is looking at aged care quality. In this case, the very first question was asked by the Salvation Army, which I think would be probably familiar to you in most markets. But they're also in that kind of NGO philanthropic space. But they do have a division that looks at aged care. So who would you recommend to them to help them think about aged care quality?
We're off and running. And like while you're putting chats in, I look at this, and the first thing I look at is quality. So I'm thinking about, that it doesn't necessarily have to be in aged care. We're just saying who's really the cream of quality when it comes to the sort of skills that we're looking for in those providers.
And thanks, Lynette. We saw your comment about joining us a bit late, but it's great to have you as part of the discussion. Does anyone have any thoughts on who you would invite into aged care?
I think that the question is like, what do they consider as like aged care quality? I would say that the fact that they are alone and nobody really like requires their talents and knowledge and really want to be like with them, I would go to the other direction, even like to very small kids, and maybe try to match what they need from an adult and what adult could give them, or an aged person.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Great thinking.
Eddie
definitely deserves a bell for that. I think that's a great angle, Eddie, because you're making it kind of reciprocal. Thinking about how you create value, multi-directional stuff. So I love that concept. Is there any organization that you can think of though, like that you think does that or thinks about that?
Yeah, I know that there are aged care like facilities, like these like homes that they have a kindergarten within their own, like where they live, and they help with it. They're like their like grandparents, and they help. So they have the patience because they're a bit slower, and some kids really love the fact that somebody is available for them, and it really makes sense that they will enjoy it.
I have a friend who runs one of these in the Netherlands, as it happens. Anyway, but come on.
Yes, thanks, Eddie. So just to end the suspense about what we thought was a good idea at the time, we actually engaged an organization called Seeing Eye Dogs in Australia, because we found out that not only did they offer amazing training for animals, that they also had this whole canine therapy thing that they were doing, which was about providing companionship and relationship for people that were living in isolation, so in the sort of home care, aged care space. But they also were quite amazing in the way they trained their own staff. So that they really made that kind of an in-house skill. It was very highly regarded, very highly respected. And so we thought, if aged care is going to be really high quality, yes, we probably do need some, canine therapy in that space, but we also need this absolute attention to detail around training of staff and, lifting staff and say aged care villages or retirement facilities to the absolute highest standard that they can be. And so, you know, being able to control that in-house, almost like McDonald's, you know, is a strategic skill. So they, you know, brought enormous contributions to that ecosystem and to that space.
Have we got time for one more?
Adi, how are we going time-wise?
We don't have that much time. I would say we have only like 2 minutes for the session, and we have an additional session afterwards. So maybe it's like, yeah, and Abby says that the next session is starting in 2 minutes. That's exactly what I said.
All right. Okay, great. All right. Well, I'll just click through this one very quickly for you then. Our third challenge was around really lifting the online educational experience. And I know that Alex has mentioned a really good exemplar in that space. But I guess, you know, when we looked at online education, we said, you know, who does this really amazingly well from a different space that could bring a significant contribution? And we actually concluded that it would be an organization like Ubisoft, because, you know, for whatever reason, you know, Johnny will continue playing his video game until midnight, but you try and get him to do an online learning experience and you'll have a feral, you know, reaction. And it's because the top scientists, the top psychologists in the world work for game development companies these days. And so they acknowledge that it's a learning experience because you need to go up levels and you need to acquire, you know, knowledge and skills. But the way they present that is way more engaging than the way a typical online university does it. And so that's the opportunity, you know, is to connect those two spaces and see how we can make, you know, really positive learning a more enjoyable experience. So guys, thank you so much for your participation and attention. And you know, we've loved interacting with you. And Adi, I might hand back over to you.
So I want to thank you both, Paul and Melanie. It's been like really interesting, and we don't have that much time, but I'm sure that if somebody wants to find you, they can go to Crazy Might Work, right? And ask you more questions. And the next session is live already. So I want to thank you for your time and for other participants, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.